For 6 seasons, this man faked his own death for a living. He'd grab his chest, he'd stagger, he'd roll his eyes up to heaven and call out to his dead wife, "Elizabeth, I'm coming to join you!" And a studio audience would scream with laughter every single time. It was the most famous bit on television. It's also the reason that, on a Friday afternoon in 1991, when the real one came, an entire room full of people stood around and laughed while he died. That's where this story starts. But it's not where it ends. Because one of them was buried in a grave that had no name on it for 16 years. One of them died on a January 4th, and the world didn't find out until the 22nd. One of them survived spinal tuberculosis, a body cast, and a wartime prison camp just to be turned into a punchline. And the very last one, the man who held the whole show together, slipped away only a few months ago. And when he went, the entire Sanford family went with him. This is the true story of how the cast of Sanford and Son died, ranked from the most shocking to the most quietly devastating. Before we get into it, do me a favor. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every one of them. Let's get started. Sanford and Son premiered on NBC on January 14, 1972. It was built from a British show called Steptoe and Son, handed to producers Bud Yorkin and Norman Lear, the same Norman Lear who'd put All in the Family on the air 1 year earlier. The premise was simple. A cranky, scheming junk dealer named Fred Sanford and his patient, frustrated son Lamont running a salvage business out of their house in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. It became one of the highest-rated shows in America. It ran for 6 seasons and 136 episodes. And it did something almost no show had done before. It put a nearly all-black cast at the center of American living rooms every Friday night. Here's the thing most people don't know. The man at the top of that show, Red Fox, didn't just star in it. He stacked it. He reached back into his own life, back to the rough nightclub circuit, back to the schoolyard in St. Louis, and he pulled his real friends up onto the screen with him. So when we count down these 10 deaths, keep that in mind. This isn't just a cast list, it's a family. And one by one, every last one of them is now gone. Number 10. Red Fox, as Fred G. Sanford, he was the whole show. Fred G. Sanford, the wheezing, scheming, big-hearted junk man, appeared in all 136 episodes across 6 seasons, and in 1973 he won a Golden Globe for playing him. TV Guide later named Fred one of the 50 greatest TV characters of all time. His real name wasn't Red Fox, it was John Elroy Sanford, born in St. Louis on December 9, 1922. He ran away from home at 13 to play washboard in a street corner band. By the 1940s, he was a nightclub comedian, working the roughest rooms in the country, recording party records so filthy they sold under the counter. He was funny in a way that scared television executives for 20 years. Then Sanford and Son made him a household name at 49. He named the character after his own brother, whose name really was Fred Sanford. Now here's how it ended. On October 11th, 1991, Fox was at Paramount Studios rehearsing a brand new sitcom called The Royal Family. He was 68 years old. It was a comeback. The IRS had spent the back half of the 80s seizing nearly everything he owned over unpaid taxes, and this show was his way back. A little after 4 in the afternoon, in the middle of rehearsal, he grabbed his chest and slumped over, and everybody laughed. Because that was the joke. That was the joke, the fake heart attack. Elizabeth, I'm coming, the bit that had made millions of people love him. The cast and crew stood there grinning, waiting for the punchline, while Red Fox had a massive real heart attack on the floor in front of them. By the time they understood it wasn't an act, the moment was gone. He was rushed to Queen of Angels Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center. He was pronounced dead at 7:45 that evening. He left almost nothing behind but debt and one of the most beloved characters in television history. His funeral drew the people who loved him, including a quiet old man named Don Bexley, who you'll meet later in this list. Fred Sanford faked 100 heart attacks to pull his son back into the room. Red Fox had his only real one in a room full of people who'd learned never to believe him. Number 9. Whitman Mayo as Grady Wilson. When Red Fox walked off the show in a contract dispute, the producers needed someone to carry it. They turned to a soft-spoken, gravel-voiced character actor named Whitman Mayo, and his character, Fred's slow, gentle, sweet-natured best friend Grady Wilson, became so popular he got his own spin-off. Whitman Blount Mayo Jr. was born in New York City on November 15, 1930, raised in Harlem and then Queens before his family moved out to Southern California when he was 17. He came up through theater, and it was on a stage that Norman Lear first spotted him and asked him to come play Grady. When Fox left, Grady stepped in as the show's anchor. NBC liked him enough to launch a series called Grady in 1975. It didn't last, and Mayo, with no ego about it, went right back to Sanford and Son where the laughs still were. Decades later, a new generation knew him as the wise old Mr. Otis in the movie Boys and the Hood. He spent his last years in Atlanta in a neighborhood called Collier Heights with his wife, Gail. On May 22, 2001, after a period of failing health, Whitman Mayo died of a heart attack. He was 70 years old. And here's the part that stops you cold. The hospital where he died was Atlanta's Grady Memorial Hospital. He played a man named Grady for the best part of a decade. And in the end, a place called Grady is where he took his last breath. His son, Ron Mayo, went on to become a member of the Georgia House of Representatives, a quiet, dignified second act for the family name. Grady Wilson was the friend who always showed up when Fred had nowhere else to turn. Whitman Mayo died in a hospital that, by pure chance, was named after the man he played. Number 8. Gregory Sierra as Julio Fuentes. He was the neighbor. Julio Fuentes, the easygoing Puerto Rican guy next door, the one with the goat, the one Fred Sanford insulted constantly and never managed to chase off. Gregory Sierra played him from 1972 to 1975 in around a dozen episodes, and he was one of the show's first recurring foils. Gregory Joseph Sierra was born in Spanish Harlem, New York on January 25, 1937. He trained in Shakespeare, the National Shakespeare Company, the New York Shakespeare Festival, before heading west. If you've seen All in the Family, you've already watched Gregory Sierra die once. He played a Jewish activist whose character was killed by a car bomb planted by neo-Nazis. A chilling little piece of television history that connects these two shows. After Sanford and Son, he became a star all over again as Detective Chano on Barney Miller, then spent decades as one of the most reliable working actors alive. Hill Street Blues, Miami Vice, Murder, She Wrote. He retired in 2018 and settled in Laguna Woods, California, with his wife Helene. Here's what makes his death sit so strangely. Gregory Sierra died of cancer, reported as stomach and liver, on January 4, 2021. He was 83. The cancer, his widow said, had hung on for a long time, and he'd fought it as long as he could and just couldn't anymore. But the world didn't know. For 18 days, one of the most recognizable faces of 1970s television was simply gone, and almost no one had heard. His death wasn't made public until January 22nd. He had been 3 weeks short of his 84th birthday. He was quite wonderful, his wife said, and my heart is broken into 400 million pieces. Julio spent years trying to be a good neighbor to a man who insulted him to his face. Gregory Sierra died on a quiet January afternoon, and for 18 days, even the world that loved him didn't know to grieve. Number 7. Don Bexley as Bubba Bexley Bubba. Fred's loyal, dim, good-natured sidekick, the guy who believed in every scheme and stuck around for every disaster. Don Bexley played him through the whole run and into the spin-offs, and he was the warm, slow heartbeat of Fred's little world. Here's the first thing you need to know. Don Bexley was already an old man when fame finally found him. Donald Thomas Bexley was born on March 10, 1910, the son of a Bible scholar and a classically trained singer. He spent half a century grinding it out as a singer, a dancer, and a comedian on the black vaudeville circuit, one of the first black comics to work the Borscht Belt. He never once appeared on television. Then in 1971, his old friend Red Fox got cast as Fred Sanford and personally walked into the producer's office and told them to hire Bexley for the role of Bubba. Don Bexley made his television debut at the age of 62. He'd waited his entire life for it. He and Fox stayed close to the very end. When Red died in 1991, Don Bexley was an honorary pallbearer. On April 15, 1997, Don Bexley died of heart and kidney failure at a hospital in Hampton, Virginia. He was 87 years old, and he'd spent his final years quietly making appearances and writing in his community. And then comes the part that should make you put your phone down. For 16 years, Don Bexley lay in a grave with no marker on it, no headstone, no name. the man who made America smile as Bubba was buried and forgotten and left in the ground unnamed. Until 2013, when a couple from Virginia who'd never met him started a fundraiser online. In 7 days, fans of an old sitcom pooled their money and finally bought Don Bexley a proper grave marker. 40 years after the show, total strangers gave him his name back. Bubba was the loyal friend nobody could ever get rid of. Don Bexley spent 16 years in a grave nobody had bothered to mark. Number 6. LaWanda Page as Aunt Esther the Bible, the Fury. Aunt Esther, Fred's Bible-thumping sister-in-law, the one who'd swing her handbag and call him a fish-eyed fool and quote scripture in the same breath. LaWanda Page played her for the entire run, and she was so good she nearly stole the whole show out from under its star. She almost didn't get the part. The network wanted a real trained actress and told Fox to fire her after the first rehearsal. He refused. Because LaWanda Page wasn't a stranger to him, she was his oldest friend in the world. She was born Alberta Peel in Cleveland on October 19, 1920, and raised in St. Louis. She and a boy 2 years younger met as children at Banneker Elementary School. That boy was Red Fox. They grew up together. And before any of that, before the fame, she had one of the strangest resumes in show business. At 15, she was a nightclub fire eater, billed as the bronze goddess of fire, lighting cigarettes with her bare fingertips and swallowing flame. She became a raunchy, fearless stand-up, one of the only women doing that kind of comedy at the time, and recorded a gold album called Watch It, Sucker! But her real life carried a weight the audience never saw. LaWanda Page married 3 times before she was 40. Every single one of those marriages ended the same way, with her husband's death. After the third, she vowed she would never marry again, and she kept that promise for the rest of her life. On September 14, 2002, LaWanda Page died in Los Angeles of complications from diabetes. She was 81. She was laid to rest in an outdoor crypt at Inglewood Park Cemetery. And the heartbreak didn't stop there. Less than 4 years later, her only daughter, an evangelist named Clara, passed away too. Aunt Esther stood in every doorway swinging her purse, quoting the Lord, never backing down from anything or anyone. LaWanda Page buried 3 husbands and then her own daughter, and still got up every week to make a whole country laugh. Number 5. Pat Morita as Achu. You know him. You just might not know you know him from this show. Before he was Mr. Miyagi, before Wax On, Wax Off, before an Academy Award nomination, Pat Morita played Ah-Chu, Lamont's friend. The polite young man Fred Sanford reached for whenever he wanted a cheap, mean little laugh. The role was small. The life behind it was anything but. Noriyuki Morita was born in Iselton, California, on June 28, 1932, the son of Japanese immigrant farm workers. At the age of 2, he developed spinal tuberculosis. He spent the next 9 years of his childhood in a body cast, in a hospital, learning to walk again, and a priest there gave him the name Patrick. Then, when he finally recovered as a teenager, the country he was born in put his family behind barbed wire. World War II had broken out, and Morita was taken straight from the hospital to a Japanese-American internment camp. He clawed his way into comedy as an adult, billing himself as the hip-nip on the nightclub circuit, which is exactly where he met Red Fox. Fox helped him land the role on Sanford and Son. That led to Arnold on Happy Days, and in 1984 it led to The Karate Kid and an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. On November 24, 2005, Pat Morita died of kidney failure at his home in Las Vegas. He was 73 years old. He was survived by his wife Evelyn and 3 daughters. Ralph Macchio, his Karate Kid, called him a generous actor, a gifted comic, and an even greater friend. Achu was the punchline Fred Sanford grabbed whenever he wanted something easy. Pat Morita learned to walk again in a body cast, lost his freedom behind a fence as a boy, and grew up to become the most beloved teacher in movie history. Number 4. Nathaniel Taylor as Rollo Lawson. Rollo, Lamont's smooth-talking best friend, the small-time hustler who'd been to jail and back, the one Fred was certain was a bad influence on his son. Nathaniel Taylor played Rollo Lawson in 32 episodes from 1972 through 1977, and the character was so well-liked he carried over into the later spin-offs. Nathaniel Taylor was born in St. Louis on March 31, 1938. He came up in the early 70s with small parts on shows like The Bill Cosby Show and Adam 12 and turns in films like Willie the Dynamite and Steve McQueen's last movie, The Hunter. But it was Rollo that stuck. He was the cool one, the one your parents warned you about, who you secretly liked best. He largely stepped away from acting in the 1980s. But in 2016, decades after the cameras stopped, Nathaniel Taylor came out of retirement for one last appearance, playing himself looking back on the show on an episode of PBS's American Masters, one final time in front of the lens, just to say it had all meant something. On February 23, 2019, he suffered a heart attack. He was hospitalized at the Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. 4 days later, on February 27th, Nathaniel Taylor died. He was 80 years old. He left behind his wife Loretta, 7 children, and a long line of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Rollo was the smooth operator Fred warned his boy to stay away from. Nathaniel Taylor stepped quietly out of the spotlight for 30 years, then came back, one last time, just long enough to say goodbye. Number 3. Slappy White as Melvin. This one is about loyalty, the real kind, the kind that lasts 50 years. On the show, Slappy White played Melvin, one of Fred's old buddies who'd turn up to scheme and reminisce. But Slappy White wasn't acting when he played Fred Sanford's old friend. He really was Red Fox's old friend. They'd been a comedy team. Melvin Edward White was born in Baltimore on September 27, 1921. Back in the 1950s and 60s, before either of them was famous, Fox and White worked the Chitlin Circuit together, the network of black theaters and clubs where a generation of legends learned their craft on tough, unforgiving stages. They were partners. They came up side by side. Slappy also had a front row seat to music history. For most of the 1960s, he was married to the great rhythm and blues singer Laverne Baker. So when Red Fox hit it big and started building his show out of the people he loved, of course there was a place for Slappy. He'd earned it on 1,000 nights in 1,000 rooms. On November 7th, 1995, 4 years after Fox died, Slappy White suffered a heart attack and passed away in Brigantine, New Jersey. He was 74 years old, and he'd kept performing right up to the end, with credits as late as Sybil and Blossom, 55 years on stage. He never really stopped. Melvin was written as Fred's friend from way back when. Slappy White didn't have to pretend for half a century. On stages all across this country, he genuinely was. Number 2. Lynn Hamilton as Donna Harris. Now we slow down, because not every story on this list is a tragedy, and this one is here to remind you of that. Lynn Hamilton played Donna Harris, a calm, capable, registered nurse, the woman who saw past all of Fred Sanford's nonsense and loved him anyway. She was his girlfriend, and then his fiancée, across the show's full run from 1972 to 1977. She was the steady hand on a very loud show. Fred never quite made it down the aisle with her, but every viewer wanted him to. She was born Alzenia Lynn Hamilton in Yazoo City, Mississippi, on April 25, 1930, and raised in Chicago. She trained at the Goodman School of Drama, where she was the only black actor among her classmates, and she earned her way up the hard route. 3 years with the New York Shakespeare Festival, a spot in President Kennedy's cultural exchange program touring the world on stage. While she was charming America as Donna, she was also playing Verdi Foster on The Waltons, a role she held from 1973 to 1981. In 1964, she married a poet and playwright named Frank Jenkins, and they stayed together, collaborating on theater for 50 years until his death in 2014. She once said something that tells you everything about her. "I think what the world needs is to laugh more and to love more, and Sanford and Son helps." On June 19, 2025, Lynn Hamilton died of natural causes at her home in Chicago. She was 95 years old, the longest-lived member of this entire cast, and she did not go alone or forgotten or in some sad hotel room. She passed peacefully, surrounded by her grandchildren, her loved ones, and the people who cared for her. Donna Harris loved Fred Sanford enough to put up with him, and never did get him to the altar. Lynn Hamilton got the one thing almost no one else on this list did: a long, full 95-year life and a soft landing in a room full of love. And number 1. DeMond Wilson as Lamont Sanford. He was the other half. The whole show was 2 men in a junkyard, and if Fred was the noise, Lamont was the heartbeat. DeMond Wilson played Lamont Sanford, the patient, frustrated, decent son trying to drag his impossible father towards something better. for 6 seasons and roughly 135 episodes. He was the straight man who made all that chaos make sense. And he's the reason we can tell this whole story now. Because Demond Wilson died on January 30th, 2026, and when he did, he was the last main cast member of Sanford and Son left alive. With him, the family was complete. All of them gone. His life was bigger than the role. Grady Demond Wilson was born in Valdosta, Georgia, on October 13, 1946, and raised in Harlem. He was a performer from the jump. He made his Broadway debut at age 4, and he was dancing on the stage of the Apollo Theater by the time he was 12. He was raised Catholic, and after a near-death experience as a boy, even considered the priesthood. Then came the war. From 1966 to 1968, Demond Wilson served in the U.S. Army with the 4th Infantry Division in Vietnam, where he was wounded in combat and awarded the Purple Heart. He came home, went back to the stage, and a guest spot on All in the Family in 1971 caught the eye of the Sanford and Son producers. They'd been thinking about Richard Pryor for Lamont. Wilson talked them out of it. "You can't put a comedian with a comedian," he told them. "You've got to have a straight man." He was right, and he became a star. But here's what makes Demond Wilson different from almost everyone else on this list. He walked away. He found fame hollow. He later said acting wasn't challenging, that it was emotionally exhausting to fake excitement he didn't feel. So in 1984, near the height of his recognition, he left Hollywood. He became an ordained minister. He founded an organization called Restoration House of America to help former prison inmates rebuild their lives. He spent the next 40 years on street ministry, on rehabilitation, on faith, not on fame. On January 30th, 2026, at his home in Palm Springs, California, Demond Wilson died following a long battle with cancers. His son said it was prostate cancer. He was 79. He was surrounded by the family he'd chosen over the spotlight. His wife of more than 50 years, Cicely, and their 6 children. Lamont Sanford spent 6 seasons trying to leave his father, and every single time he couldn't do it. Demond Wilson did the thing his character never could. He left. He left the fame, he left the noise, and he built a quieter, larger life on his own terms. He was the last man standing from that junkyard. Until just a few months ago, he wasn't. So let's say their names, because that's the whole point of doing this. Red Fox, who died in a room full of people who'd been trained to laugh at his collapse. Whitman Mayo, who took his last breath in a hospital that shared his character's name. Gregory Sierra, gone for 18 days before the world even knew. Don Bexley, 16 years in an unmarked grave until strangers gave him his name back. LaWanda Page, who buried 3 husbands and a daughter and kept on making us laugh. Pat Morita, who survived a body cast and a prison camp to become the teacher we all wished we'd had. Nathaniel Taylor, who came back one last time just to say goodbye. Slappy White, 55 years on stage and a friend to the end. Lynn Hamilton, who got the long, gentle life the others didn't. And Demond Wilson, the last one home. Only 2 of the people who walked through that junkyard are still with us today. Hal Williams, who played Officer Smitty, and Howard Platt, who played Officer Hoppy. 2 surviving names from a show that defined a decade. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. Red Fox built that show out of his own friends. The people he came up with, the people he loved, the ones who'd stood next to him on broken down stages when nobody was watching. He gave them all one last glorious act together, and now the lights are off on every one of them. The junkyard's empty, the family's whole again, just not the way any of us want it. A man on that show faked dying 100 times to get the people he loved to stay in the room with him. In the end, every one of them really did go, and somehow, knowing how the story ends, the joke doesn't feel like a joke anymore. It feels like a goodbye none of them knew they were rehearsing. So let me ask you this, and tell me down in the comments. Out of all 10, which one hit you the hardest? Was it Bubba's grave? Was it Fox on that studio floor? Or was it the last man standing, finally going home? Take a second and let them know they're still remembered. Like this video so more people find it. Subscribe if you want the next show, and I'll see you in the next one.